Greetings, students, and welcome to today's video lecture. We're going to spend quite a bit of time just kind of walking through our subject matter for today, which is planning and implementing change-oriented strategies. So we've talked throughout your coursework about the methodology that social workers use in terms of how they intervene with families and how they assess and the different roles that they play. We've also learned about the importance of ethics and values. And we've learned about interviewing techniques and so forth. But today we're going to talk about the different types of strategies that social workers and other professionals use to actually start to look at how to work with the different groups in terms of some different strategies, some different outcomes. So today we're going to just dig into planning and implementing these change-oriented strategies. So there are 5 that we're going to look at. We have your task-centered systems. We have crisis intervention. We have cognitive restructuring, solution-focused, and case management. So these are all different types of approaches that you can utilize that have different methodologies and different skills and tasks and steps that are needed to do the work with the client. So when we think about these change-oriented strategies, we need to think about the person and the environment that they are actually in. We need to have emphasis on positive helping. We need to be looking at a problem-solving models that provides the structure for and the guidelines for the work with clients. So that when we enter into these working relationships, that everybody is real clear about how to do what by when. So that's a really important piece. It also needs to really include a focus on diversity and oppression rather, and also looking at relationships and empowerment. So it's about really trying to tailor an approach to the folks that you are actually serving, what's going to work best for them in terms of that. Also needing to be aware of the flexibility within the different types of problem-solving methods and understanding a little bit about the theories behind each of them to figure out what's going to work for your clients. You may have clients who come in, 2 or 3 different clients that come in with the same presenting issues, and if you're assessed, you can figure out that they might be very similar in terms of their impact on this family or this individual or functioning or behavior. But how you approach it might be based on looking at a different type of a strategy to look at those same types of problems across 3 different particular client groups. So again, just kind of depends. So once you're familiar with the strategies, then it can be a little bit more helpful in terms of you making a decision about which ones work the best. So there are planning goal attainment strategies. It's about addressing problems and looking at the appropriate approach. It's about, is it relevant, appropriate to the person, family, or group? Is it appropriate, compatible to the basic values and ethics of social work? Are you skilled enough to know about using this type of an approach? Is there empirical and conceptual evidence to support using this approach? So the planning, goal attainment strategies. So when we think about tasks, we think about steps that are needed in order to get to a goal. So task-centered systems are really looking at a different theoretical framework. They also tend to work really well with minors, and it has an application within diverse groups. So it works across a lot of different clientele rather. And so we'll look at a little bit further here to see what some of those things might look like. So basically your task-centered model is like really looking at what are the tasks that we need to think about and develop that will help you actually get to the actual goal of what it is you're trying to accomplish. So the general tasks for, there'll be tasks for the client, there'll be tasks for you as a social worker, And then you'll need to be developing specific tasks. So are they behavioral tasks or are they cognitive tasks? So if, I'm thinking about um, modifying some behavior that a client might be having, then there might be certain steps that I might want them to actually take or certain things to do to start to look at changing that particular behavior. When I'm thinking about cognitive tasks, I'm thinking about, things that are associated with thought and cognition. So I'm looking at, are there things, am I thinking or are my clients thinking about things in ways that are problematic? And so is there a way to then intervene with some different tasks that we can have them do that might actually minimize some of that type of behavior. And then brainstorming some alternative tasks. So again, it gets to be a creative process, and then you can sit and think about things with your client that you might want to try in terms of things that might work. So this task-centered model is really looking at enhancing the client's commitment to carry out the task. So the rewards, the incentives, if you're able to do certain things, that then there are positives in it for you. The plan details and details carrying out of tasks. So what is the practitioner going to do? So what am I as a social worker going to do to set this dynamic in place in terms of helping plan those tasks? I'm going to analyze and then resolve obstacles. So are there barriers or the things that come about that we either anticipate or didn't anticipate that might be keeping people from getting to those tasks, and then reassessing and changing those as we need to, as well as assessing the readiness for those tasks. We can practice and rehearse those particular tasks as well. So the client can work with you. Let's say they need to have a conversation with their younger child about some behavior that they are seeing or experiencing. And in the past, the child has not responded very well to that type of feedback. So what we might do is we can think about or brainstorm and come up with some different strategies about how to approach that particular issue, and then role model a conversation in terms of what it might look like for you as the client to have that conversation with that child, and saying the things that you would say to that child to see about whether you get a different type of response. So that's an example of actually practicing a behavior and then rehearsing it, role playing it, and then actually bringing it to fruition with the actual participants that are involved, and then summarizing that task plan. So sometimes tasks fail. So there's a failure to complete tasks, or basically people don't follow through. So we had a conversation, we role played the dialogue that we're going to have with the 7-year-old when we got home. And then when we meet again next week, and I ask you about how that particular conversation went, well, we didn't get around to doing it, or it just failed miserably and things got worse. So we need to also, as practitioners, really start to think about performance problems that are related to the task. So, are there a crisis that happen at this particular time? Are they prepared enough? Is there a lack of support for that piece? Is there a lack of commitment? Were you clear enough in terms of the specificity of what you wanted people to do in terms of that task? Because sometimes if it's vague, it could go awry in terms of that. So when tasks don't work, doesn't mean that the particular system that we have chosen is a bad system. It means that we maybe need to do some further work to really do some problem solving to understand what is driving that particular outcome. We also know, as we think about why things still are not happening, if people are in a place where they just don't have any hope and believe that things are going to change, then the likelihood of them moving forward with a task is probably not going to happen. Conflicting needs and wants. So, I might really want to, I really need to stop drinking, but I really enjoy it and I want to keep drinking. So if I've got that conflict that's happening for me, then it's going to make it hard for me to follow through with the task, as well as not always understanding what the consequences are. So I think that's one of the things that can always, as social workers, really be clear with clients about is when we provide them with a choice about how they want to impact or change their lives, just to be real clear with them about what the pros of doing this particular thing that we're looking at as a plan, as well as the cons, what's going to happen or what are the things that could go wrong if we stay on the following track, but then also having the wisdom and the grace to allow the client to make the decision as they see fit, not necessarily as you see fit. And then monitoring that particular process once you've got a system of tasks that are in place with clear goals to see whether there's some limitations or whether we need to restructure or whether things are working the way that they need to. So basically, when we're looking at a target-centered approach, if we just kind of look at the flow chart here, it's basically this. We're looking at that particular problem that's been identified. We're talking about what's the goal, what we need to be different, what are the steps and the tasks that we need generally to move those particular things forward, and then what is the specific things that you need to do? What's the homework? What's the things that we're going to take from the session and actually do in real time, and then we're going to monitor the progress. We want to enhance the client's commitment to carrying out the task. So, we also want to plan the details of carrying it out so that what it looks like as we get to the other side. Analyzing, looking for obstacles we always have to look at because, the best laid plans often run into things that we just don't anticipate or we don't see. So we need to start thinking about those ahead of time, as well as rehearsing those practice behaviors and then summarizing that task plan. Again, we have a lot of reasons why sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. So it's incumbent upon you as a social worker to really try and understand and learn more about these things when there's low task performance or when people are not doing it to the ability that they need to make the adequate change that we need to actually see made. So, these things here could be the potential issues for why people aren't doing that. So always making sure that we're checking these things. So, if I've got clients who are coming back after 2 or 3 weeks and we've got some plans in place, some tasks to be done, and they're not happening, I'll probably go through this list to really kind of think through for me as a social worker, as well as to ask the client about whether any of these things are actually true and accurate for them, because that will have a large determination about what we do next. Looking at devote the time to reviewing that progress. We've got to spend the time to actually look to see whether things are actually working in terms of how they've been laid out. We've got to explore those barriers, and we just got to really kind of figure out when we need to renegotiate tasks based on barriers or whether we have the attributes in place to actually overcome them. So again, reviewing all these things and monitoring the progress is an integral part of the task-centered approach. Here are some different aspects of it. Again, as you know, in social work, we try to do everything in an evidence-based fashion. So there's a lot of data. It's been a process that's been around for more than 30 years. These are the folks that it tends to be pretty effective with. So if you've got clients or families that are experiencing these types of issues, you may want to consider whether the task-centered approach might make the more sense for you, as well as it's also demonstrated some efficacy across diverse populations. So it works with a lot of different folks. It also honors people's ability to look at their own empowerment and self-determination and what their strengths are. Some of the limitations that it might not be as effective with involuntary clients. So if I've got clients who really don't want to be here and work on anything anyway, it's a lower likelihood that they're going to actually kind of follow through and do the pieces that they're being asked to do, because if they don't see the value in it, they're probably not going to do it. The time limits, sometimes, if we don't have enough time to see sufficient change, that could be problematic. And then the systematic structures that impede that particular therapeutic relationship. So, if it's a time limited piece, or if we can only meet X number of times per week for an hour, is that sufficient time to make sure that things are done the way that they need to be done? So that summarizes kind of the task-centered piece. It's an approach that I've utilized many, many times in my work with clients in a lot of different areas and found it to be actually pretty successful. Let's move on to crisis intervention. So crisis intervention is a different methodology in terms of doing work with your clients. It's based on kind of a triage system. In other words, we're looking at assessing affective, behavioral, and emotional functioning. We're assessing the severity of the situation that the client might be experiencing, and we're planning an appropriate strategy for that person. So, the crisis stage, or the definition of the crisis stage, understanding that, and then the crisis reaction. So typically when people are in crisis, there's an initial shock or tension that a person experiences. Uh, the second part of that stage is that they usually resort to problem solving skills to reduce that tension. And then the third step is usually the increased tension, feeling overwhelmed, helpless, and angry and depressed. So when you've got a crisis, you've got people who have had their worlds pretty much altered in a short space of time with some fairly traumatic things that could happen to them. A crisis could be involve domestic violence. It could involve someone being seriously injured. It can involve life-threatening behavior on the part of the folks who are involved. So a crisis is just that. It's a crisis. It's an emergency. It's an unplanned event that happens in people's lives that throw pretty much all of our emotional and affective and behavioral functioning for a loop. So we need to think about it from that standpoint. So when we're thinking about crisis intervention, we got to think about there's some other things that we have to contend with as well. Duration of contact. Typically, with crisis situations, the duration of contact is not that significant, or it's not a long period of time. So many of you know that, for example, on a couple of weekends a month, I do crisis line work at a domestic violence shelter. And so, when I'm on the phone or the phone rings and I've got someone who's in a crisis, my job is to really try to understand what that crisis is, to pay attention to the affect and some of the emotional things that I might be hearing, to really kind of help people plan through or help them really understand what they might be feeling or experiencing at that particular time. And then to also then kind of start to think about really truly understand the situation, having them explain the story to me, and then us together kind of problem solving in terms of what do we need to do right now to get you to an environment where you're safe. And so the crisis piece is a little bit different. So it works pretty well with minors. It's got some good theoretical frameworks. It also has been proven to work across diverse groups. And it also has some benefits into the crisis because you're also teaching people how to take care of themselves if they're in similar situations again. So we need to look at this particular process, and these are pretty straightforward. Define the problem, making sure that the client's safe, providing the support, examine the alternatives, making a plan, getting a commitment from that particular client about doing that. So, if I get a call and I've got a person who is experiencing domestic violence, them and their children are afraid, they have a window of time where they can talk because the perpetrator of the violence is not in the home at the time, but is probably going to return. So the first thing I'm looking at is safety. Are you in a safe place? And if that person has access to the building again or to your home with keys, then you may not be in a safe place. So what can we do to support you in terms of that? Can we assist you in maybe getting to a safer location? Are there relatives, friends, other support systems that you can maybe access? Do you have reliable transportation that we can get you somewhere? Do we need to call the police? So I'm looking at all of these particular things as we're moving forward. We're examining the alternatives. Would a shelter placement be something if you could just disappear for a few days or a few months and give this particular situation a chance to boil over while you make alternate plans about where you live, what do you want to do? We can work with that whole piece as well too. So making the plan, making sure that we try to get as much of a commitment as we actually can. And people are in different states of readiness. So sometimes we can walk through and come up with a great plan and people will not follow through it. And oftentimes, just because of the nature of crisis work, we may never actually know whether that came to fruition or not. So we're going to also talk a little bit about the strengths and limitations of crisis intervention. So there's this 6-step modeling piece. And so part of our training as crisis advocates is that we are good listeners. We have to be listening with the intent to define the problem, to make sure that we are looking at providing the right support. And then there is this continuum of what the crisis worker needs to do. So when we're listening and just kind of getting a scope of what the issues are, we're pretty non-directive. in terms of that. So if while we're assessing, then we look at moving into action when we start to think about alternatives, making a plan and doing a commitment. So I'm collaborating, but chances are, if I'm in a crisis worker piece and things have escalated and we're into the acting phase, I might be directive. And so I might be looking at, where the client is. Is the client mobile? Are they partially mobile? Are they immobile? And so based on where they are, will be determine how I move forward. So, if a client is talking and they are mobile and they're basically looking at some good planning and problem solving in terms of how to resolve the issue, there's not enough need for me to be directive. If they're partially mobile, I might need to give them a little bit of encouragement in terms of looking at some different alternatives. If they're hysterical and totally immobile, then I'm probably going to be in the role of just being directive. I need you to do this, 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 and this in terms of how we might intervene. So again, the crisis piece, kind of going back here, is that 6-step model that really looks at this this continuum, and it's a little bit different than some of the other models. And keep in mind that it's very oftentimes short-lived in terms of the level of the intervention, because we're trying to get them to a safe place and then potentially pass them on to more appropriate services or services that are more long-term that can help them resolve some of those issues. Cognitive restructuring. So we've got a theoretical framework that this has been researched and dealt with for a while. I myself also have run some cognitive behavioral therapy and restructuring groups. And this is really an interesting type of a therapeutic intervention and approach, because it really helps people understand that what happens in their mind, the cognition, how they think about things, will ultimately drive behavior. And so if we can help people understand the connection between their thoughts and how they behave, then we can start to restructure that into a way that has more positive outcomes for the clients that are experiencing these types of issues. So there's a lot of empirical data. It tends to work across diverse groups, and there are some specific processes. It's also about cognitive distortions, I should say, in terms of other words, people thinking things that may not quite be accurate. And if they believe that in their minds, then they're going to continue to respond in a way that supports their belief. And so once we are able to surface what those distortions are, those thinking irregularities, then we can start to replace them with some different, more concrete or more viable thoughts for them. So it really involves these steps here. It's about accepting the self-statements, assumptions, and the beliefs that mediate a person's reactions to their life events. So, we all experience stress and trauma at some particular points in time in our lives, and how we deal with them becomes very, very important. So recognizing that piece is going to be very important for our clients. Being able to engender the dysfunctional cognitions, to really be able to sort them out, to figure out what they are, and to help clients substitute functional self-statements and self-defeating cognitions, and also to assist clients in rewarding themselves for those coping pieces. So, if I've got, think back to the cognitive skills groups that I used to run for multiple DWI offenders. And so if I've got people who have had 3, 4, 5, 6 DWIs and have been in legal trouble as a result of that, then part of what needs to happen during the time that I work with them through those 12 sessions was to really do some educational pieces around teaching them about how their thinking plays a role, a clear role in the fact that they continue to drive under the influence and face those particular consequences. So it's about really bringing that to their attention. And looking at those beliefs and patterns that actually support that type of behavior. And as we work through the process in this 12-week series that I used to do, we would get to a point where we would look at how to replace some of those thoughts and how to replace some of those actions with different ways of being and thinking and responding in the world. And this would often lead to a lower incidence of people actually getting behind the wheel of the car and drinking again, putting themselves as well as many others in jeopardy. So again, and then teach them to reward themselves around that. So however, there are limits and there are some strengths and there are some cautions. So we need to also know that, with all of these particular approaches, there are some short-sighted pieces as well too. So that's why we have to look at really what works best for that particular client. And so, these are some examples of some beliefs and some self-expectations. So it's about really helping clients kind of sort through what they actually are. And once we understand them, then we can start to look at how we can focus on changing them. For example, here's a daily log where we have a person here who is looking at trying to join a group at lunchtime. And then they're kind of rating themselves in terms of how they feel. Are they scared? Are they stuck? And then what are the beliefs or statements that go along with this this particular that support that behavior? And so if I'm believing that they don't like me or they're going to diss me, then that's why I'm going to be feeling scared and stuck about whether I want to join them at lunch. And so as long as I stay in that mind frame, I'll probably stay stuck in that behavior. So this is an example, that we could do with a client who is experiencing some of those cognitive distortions in terms of seeing the world the way they do and helping them unsee the world the way that works well too. Now on to solution focused treatment. And so some of the tenets here is that it's got some theoretical framework, good numbers in terms of being effective with minors. And it also applies and works across a diverse group. So there's some research that really kind of supports those things. And so when we think about the solution focus procedures and techniques, definition of the description of the problem, develop some well-formed goals, exploring exceptions, in the session feedback, and then evaluating progress or steps that we're going to look at in terms of. So we're looking at creating or moving towards a solution in terms of from day one, we're doing that piece. And then case management. And so case management is one that, a lot of social workers would do over the course of their time. So it's a different practice model that really looks at a number of different things. So there's some standards, there's some empirical data around case management, as well as some case management functions. And there are lots of roles, more enhanced roles, I think, for the case managers in terms of some of the other processes that we looked at that might even be greater roles here for them in terms of that. And we're also going to look at the strengths and the limitations. So when we're looking at case management, we have to do this assessing, we have to do the outreach, do the initial intake and the screening, really just kind of get a sense of where things are at. We do a multi-dimensional assessment, so we look at a number of different functions. So for us as social workers, not a new thing. We look at a lot of different aspects of client functioning to begin with, so we can make an accurate diagnosis as opposed to looking at just some of the areas of functioning and not all of them. So also, and then we can look at the goals and objectives by collaborating with that person based on the results of that assessment and that outtake. The other pieces of case management are also that planning and the intervention and linking people to resources. So we plan, we figured out what's wrong, we come up with an idea and some goals about what things need to be different. We looked at what some of the tasks might be. And so now it's about connecting people with the resources and the intervention. So if I, as a case manager, am not able to do all of the things that are required within that case plan, then it's my responsibility to find other resources that can do those things as well, and to have them be a part of that treatment team for that particular individual. We're going to be monitoring progress and making sure the services are actually work. We're going to reassess at certain intervals. So I might come back every 2 months to get a sense of whether things are working the way that they're supposed to. And then we're going to do an evaluation and determination as we move to that particular phase. So that is case management. And that brings us to a close in terms of looking at and exploring a little bit of the different change approaches or change-oriented approaches that you'll be utilizing as a social worker as you're in the field, as you're in your placements, and things of that particular nature as well too. So I encourage you to do your readings for the night to get a better understanding of those. And then I can pretty much assure you that there will be some in-class activities that will involve these particular methodologies that you'll get a chance to try in real time. So see you in class.